Ian Tattersall has been one of the leaders in the field of the study of human evolution for over 40 years. He's searched for fossils and studied animal behaviour all over the world. He's now a curator emeritus at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And he's published a book called Masters of the Planet, of which it's been said when you read this book, you will never look at yourself or your species with the same eyes again. I can certainly testify that it's a wonderfully engaging look at how we came to be the last hominid standing. So when I talked to Ian, I started off by asking him to cast his mind back 6 or 7 million years and describe just how many versions of what were to become human beings were around then.
Well, one of the very interesting things about the human family tree is it was very bushy from the very start. In the period between about 4 and 7 million years ago, we have at least 4 different genera of hominids, that is to say, creatures more closely related to us than to any of the living apes have been described. So there's been a lot of hominids around from the very beginning.
And why did the others die out? Was it a matter of competition between themselves, between us and them, or was it the environment?
Well, we're talking about a very long history, and the origination and the extinction of species is a pretty routine kind of thing in evolutionary histories. In fact, this is what the evolutionary history of virtually every group is saturated with. So what is unusual about us is not being one among many different species, but basically being the only species of our family on Earth.
And what's the explanation for that? I mean, is it something about our nature that has led us to be the only ones still around?
I think that's right. I think that basically we're the only hominid on Earth today because of the very special kind of creature we are. And we're very special in an unprecedented sense. We're not simply an improved version of our predecessors, but we do business in the world quite differently from anything else.
And how would you summarize what that difference is?
I think the difference is in how we manipulate information in our minds. What we do is to take the world around us and deconstruct it into a vocabulary of mental symbols that we can shuffle around and thereby create new visions of the world. I think every other species that is related to us in the world today, that we know of in the world today, basically lives in the world as it immediately presents itself to them. But we deal with the world by abstracting it and creating new versions of it in our minds.
And when do you think we began to do that? Was it that we got a bigger brain, and then as soon as we got a bigger brain, we could start to come up with symbols and language and so on? Or was it a more gradual process?
I think it's not simply a matter of a bigger brain. Our close relatives, the Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, had big brains. They had brains as big as ours are, but they don't seem to have used those brains to reconstruct the world in exactly the same way that we do. And our acquisition of this capacity to deconstruct the world actually, I think, is very recently acquired indeed. In fact, acquired since we became anatomically the creatures that we are.
So we got the big brain. We were already upright. We had the opposable thumbs and all those things.
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't immediately begin to use it to figure out how to sort of look at the world in a different way.
Apparently not. The first human fossils that we have, in the sense that we can recognize them as anatomically identical to ourselves, are about 200,000 years old, or maybe a little bit less, and they come from Ethiopia. In Africa. And these very early predecessors at more than one site in Ethiopia seem to have behaved pretty much as their own predecessors had done, and as other hominids living in different parts of the world also did at the same time. It seems to be a little bit later that humans started behaving in the strange symbolic way in which we do.
And are you prepared to hazard a guess as to what led us finally to realize that we could use our equipment in this particular way?
This is an extraordinarily good question, of course, and nobody has the definitive answer to it. But I think that by about 200,000 years ago, in our anatomically recognizable species, Homo sapiens, the neural equipment, the brain necessary, had evolved to permit us to behave in our own modern symbolic manner. And that it took a while for us to actually discover how to use this brain. As indeed, it took a while for the ancestors of birds to discover how to use their feathers to fly. Our tetrapod ancestors, who were the first vertebrate creatures to develop limbs, had them in the oceans for a long time before they used them to haul themselves out on land. And I think that we had a brain capable of symbolic thought, which we had to wait a while to discover its potential. And I believe that potential was discovered probably by the invention of language.
Now, there's you mention in the book that it looks as if there were several periods during our relatively short history when there was a bottleneck, where presumably environmental factors squeezed us down so that there were only a few of us around. Do you think it was those environmental stresses that produced the need to come up with some different way of dealing with the world?
I think it might well have been, but I think it was more a question of the circumstances than the need. To incorporate a novelty in any population of any kind of mammal, let alone humans, you need to have a small effective population size, because big populations are just too large. They have too much genetic inertia to move them in any particular direction. And I think that in our own case, it was necessary to have small, isolated populations in order for new things to become implanted.
There's a point where you speculate that possibly this original idea of language, beginning with naming objects and putting those together, might have been invented by children.
That's quite possible. When you think about it, adults are less capable of learning than children are. You know, there is this wonderful example of the macaques in Japan who learned how to wash sweet potatoes in the ocean in order to get the grit off them before they ate them. And this technique was first discovered by juveniles in the troop, and then it spread to the sub-adults in the troop, and then to the adult females, and probably to then some of the less dominant males. And I suspect that probably the most dominant males in the troop never learned how to do it at all. But we can see the need that children have to act differently from their parents, to do things in a different way, and to adopt new ways of doing things. So I think it's much more likely that language was developed among children, as we've seen a sign language developed among deaf children in Nicaragua, than it was to have developed among adults.
And in the book, you cite some fascinating evidence which suggests that you can study the way phonemes develop across the world to almost track back where language might have begun.
Yeah, this is work done by Quentin Atkinson in New Zealand, who has noticed that, in fact, the distribution of phonemes, the basic building blocks of words, is actually more informative about how languages may have diversified than the words themselves, because words change very quickly, but the basic sounds we use to build words don't change as quickly. And Atkinson has seen that you have the most phonemes in Africa, where our species originated, and as you move further away through Europe into further flung Asia and into Oceania, the number of phonemes decreases, which is a result of what they call serial founder effect, by which elements get lost as they get dispersed. So this suggests that language, just as the human species itself was invented in Africa and spread outwards from Africa to the rest of the world.
And presumably it was those of our ancestors who had language who made that successful exodus from Africa, the second exodus from Africa, which spread Homo sapiens across the world. When we made that exodus, we had language in your view.
Yes, I think that's entirely true. As you suggest, this was a second exodus. We find Homo sapiens fossils in the Levant, close to Africa, in Israel, at over 100,000 years ago. And this is before we find evidence in the fossil record or the archaeological record for the kind of symbolic behaviors that characterize us today.
And that exodus was not successful. We were kind of beaten back in that first version when we went without.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. It appears that after this initial foray of modern Homo sapiens, who behaved just like Neanderthals and other hominid species existing at the time, this foray was unsuccessful, and eventually climatic forces made human beings, Homo sapiens, retreat into Africa. And it was only at a second time, at around maybe 70 to 60,000 years ago, that Homo sapiens, having in the meantime developed this symbolic way of thinking, language capacities and so forth, managed to move out of Africa, and then in a very short period of time spread all over the earth and displace all the other human species living in the earth at that time.
Do you think that the fact that we did that we displaced all the other human species, essentially means that we wiped them out, or did we just outcompete them? What does it say about us as a species that we are the only one left standing?
Well, this is the question with our innate sense of guilt. You know, we always feel compelled to ask. In fact, there really is very little direct evidence for one theory or another on this. But I think the thing that we need to recognize is that extinction is a routine thing in the history of life. Species have been originated and they become extinct all the time. Extinction by itself is not something that we need to seek a special explanation for. But the fact that human beings managed to spread out of Africa into Europe, where the Neanderthals were, into Eastern Asia, where Homo erectus was, where Homo floresiensis was, and really eliminate all the competition in a small time, really suggests that there's something very special about us. And I think it lies basically in our planning capacities, our intellectual capacities, that make us an insuperable kind of competition for any hominid who didn't have that capacity.
Was going to lose out. It's not necessarily that we're innately vicious, but just better at catching the game, better at harvesting the resources.
That's right. On the other hand, you know, we know what we're like as a species. We know we have a rather poor track record in terms of how we treat our fellow populations of humans, let alone other species like chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans who are becoming extinct, even as we're speaking. So I wouldn't want to suggest that there was no direct conflict between humans and other hominid species as our own species expanded. But I think that basically it's because we were more effective utilizers of the environment, because we had better extractive abilities from the environment, that we managed to replace all other species. The very first humans who came into Europe were obviously there in much greater densities than the Neanderthals who were resident there at the time. The Neanderthals had been there a long time in Europe. They had been very successful, but they'd always lived in rather low density, as far as we can tell from the number of sites that we find, per square mile, per 1,000 square miles of the environment. Early humans obviously arrived there in much larger numbers. They were more densely packed on the landscape, and I don't think the Neanderthals ever really had a chance.
Let me ask a simplistic question, but it's just that when you talk about the extraordinary changes in a very short length of time, really, that our species has undergone, is it all over? Have we finished evolving, or is evolution still going on for our species?
That's a very obvious question to ask, and a very provocative question, if you want. We see that we are not perfect. We see that there are very many deficiencies that we have. We see that our assessment of risk is very bad. We see that all kinds of cognitive deficiencies that we have in making judgments about all kinds of things. We see that our backs go out. We see that our knees go out. We see that we have fallen arches. We see that there are all kinds of theoretical deficiencies that we have despite all of our success. And we have to ask, well, if we've come this far, then is evolution going to take us even further? And I think that we have to step back when we ask this question. If we extrapolate from the past and we look at how far we've come in a very short time, we have to conclude that we're on a trajectory. But then we look at our demographic circumstances and we have to step back and ask ourselves, well, what are the circumstances that are necessary for change? And I've already alluded to the fact that novelties are most likely to become incorporated into small, tiny populations, which are genetically unstable and which do not have the inertia necessary to sort of suppress all the and regress to the mean in all of the novelties that arise. But today, our circumstances are not like that at all. Today, in a very, very short time, we have grown. Our population has grown to populate all inhabitable areas of the Earth. It's incredibly dense. Within the population, we have unprecedented mobility. Any of us can be on the other side of the world in 24 hours. These are not the circumstances in which you expect innovations to be implanted. So, from my point of view, I think the prospects, if things remain the same, which anybody can imagine circumstances in which they might not be, but if circumstances remain the same, I don't think there is any real prospect for biological innovation in our population. On the other hand, on the cultural level, it's completely different. On the cultural level, we have an infinite range of possibilities. Our history over the last 50,000 years has been one not of cultural stasis, not of things not changing for long, long periods of the time, as used to be the case while we were evolving. Now change is the norm. And this is different. Change is what we expect, and there's no reason not to expect more cultural change in the future. I think the possibilities on the cultural level are infinite.
So when those kids somewhere in Africa invented words all that time ago, they set us on an incredible journey.
I think they did. And nobody has any idea where that journey will end.
Ian Tattersall, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.